And so,
hey, buddy, if you want to be cool,
yeah,
come join this cult.
tell us that this line is this length. And so the
Tell us this line.
right, I don't know. Welcome to Cult Favorite, the podcast whose phasers are set on stun. I don't know. I just wanted a Star Trek reference.
That's good.
Is it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. We had a lot that didn't make the cut. That's the best that we had, everybody. That was the best one. I'm Miranda Simmons.
I'm Mike Altman. We are two religious studies professors trying to understand all of these cult documentaries that you can't stop binge watching. If you want to support the show, everybody, you can follow us on Instagram or Twitter/X, or as of this morning, also on TikTok.
Don't you have to have videos for TikTok?
You just have to have. You can have an image with audio.
Do you see? This is how much I learned from our TikTok episode.
Yeah.
Practically nothing about the platform.
You learned a lot
about the group.
We all learned a lot
about Shekinah.
No,
and
but yeah, all at Cult Favorite Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And also be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify or Apple. Leave us a rating or review. If you see someone put their phone down, steal it and subscribe to this podcast.
Rude.
While they're not paying attention.
Rude.
It's not. It's a gift.
Okay.
It's a little surprise because they're gonna be like, "What is this?"
Sure.
And then
sure.
Today we're gonna move to the second part of our conversation about Heaven's Gate, but just real fast before we get started, just a quick content warning that with the Heaven's Gate discussion, we do have discussions of suicide. So if you need to skip that, please do so. That said, this is our second episode on Heaven's Gate, and the first one we were really focused on the first two episodes, which really were all about the early founding of the group by T and Do in the 1970s, and in the first episode and the second one, its development up through the 90s, and it kind of left us at the end of episode 2 in a kind of cliffhanger about sort of as the graduation, the mass suicide, whatever we want to call it, the exiting sort of was about to happen or was happening. And so this is the episodes in front of us now, 3 and 4, are about sort of that event and then the kind of aftermath and fallout from that event.
Yeah, because when T dies, there's really an upheaval and they have to regroup. And so you'll recall that Do let everybody go home. All but one person returned. And the second half of the documentary series goes into more of a discussion about what kind of attitudes and behaviors inside of the group tracked as super weird for the people commentating about it. It starts episode 3 starts with a big discussion of brainwashing and the role of social manipulation and pressure. We learn about the group's love of Star Trek, The Next Generation specifically. I'm not mad at that. I'm going to get back into that later and regale you with why I think Star Trek The Next Generation is such a masterwork of contemporary art. But that they were also really edited sexually. We talked about that a little bit last time, but in the third and fourth episodes, they go into the way that a few of the men in the group decided to go through castration procedures to rid themselves of their sex drives. We learn about how, when, and why they geared up for their exit, how they became early adopters of the internet and used that in their final push to recruit people as they saw the end looming. The Hale-Bopp comet arrived in 1996, and that was really when they started making plans, because they saw that comet, which was just visible to anyone in the night sky, as a sign, as confirmation of what they'd been saying since the 70s. There were also, it deserves being said, and I was glad that the documentary went into this, that lots of conspiracy theories swirled in the ethers at the time. There was a conspiracy theory that the US government was hiding the existence of a flying saucer in the trail of the Hale-Bopp comet. And that one in particular was one that Heaven's Gate really clutched onto, because for them, like, that was proof of what they had been saying. It was a sign that the portal was opening, and that inside this flying saucer was T, and that she was coming back for them in that ship. Then we also learn about the deaths that occurred and what the fallout was in the media, and then for the families, of course, of these people. So I think interesting to note is that of the 39 people who died in March 1997 in Rancho Santa Fe, in that big house, there were 21 women and 18 men, and they ranged in age from 26 to 72. So, like, as we think about what kind of demographics characterize a cult, because there's lots of grasping for doing, like, among the commentators and the talking heads, to say, like, here are the kind of people that enter a cult, and then they try to, like, mess with that and say, well, it could happen to anyone, and a lot of people are educated and they're actually from good families, and all of that description around, you'd think this, but actually this. In the process of all of that, I think it's important to note that they really did span a spectrum of age, and that they were pretty equal, like women and men. And then we hear about the exit videos that they made, the attitudes that they had, and what the media did in the wake of their deaths. You found a cool interview with the director that where he talks about character arcs.
Yeah.
I think that's
definitely part of it,
right? Like, because then that lets us get Frank Lyford, and who was he and his girlfriend Erica joined the group back in the 70s. He was in it for, like, going on 20 years. And then he left the group feeling pretty hurt and angry. He has a lot of resentment. He left with, I mean, we hear his speech be really halted and faltering. He developed a speech impediment that he blames on the interactions that he had with Doe and the controlling demeanor that Doe had inside the group. But counterposed to Frank Lyford is our pal Sawyer, who also joined in the 70s and was a core member for a couple decades. Leaves the group for very different reasons. We'll talk about that. But who still believes, who still looks for signs, who leaves with a very sympathetic view toward the group. And it was interesting, near the end of the fourth episode, Sawyer is asked about Frank and Erica, and he calls them both beautiful souls. And then Frank is asked about Sawyer, and he says that he thinks he's really stuck. And so just to get into their backstories and hear their own interrelationships, I guess is the...
Yeah. So looking at these last two episodes, like, what do you want to talk about, Miranda?
So much.
What do you want to talk about?
So much. I mean,
the segment where I ask you, what do you want to talk about?
Right. One of the things that I want to talk about are people's obsession with making meaning when they confront situations that scare them. Like, we discussed last time some of the people who were interviewed for the documentary. And so we have sociologists who are in the mix. We have scholars. We have former members. We have family members. And one of the things that really stuck with me was the links that all of them, in different ways, with very different approaches and with very different conclusions, the links that they went to try to make this make sense. And so that's why I think at the beginning of the third episode, there's such a big discussion about brainwashing.
Yeah.
For the sociologists, especially Yanya Lalish, and then we get also introduced to Steve Hassan, that they had a lot to say about Doe as a strategic, intentional leader. He planned everything. He was, like setting a trap for people to fall into. Lalish calls it murder. In the like, as soon as the deaths happened, and she's being interviewed, she talks about it as him murdering them. Folks talk about indoctrination. There's a part that I thought was really interesting where Steve Hassan talks about the Ash conformity study. Did you know what that was?
I had never heard of it before.
The Ash conformity study is like, it was made in the 50s. It was a social experiment in which there's like a group of 6 people, and I don't know if it was actually 6, but like it's a group of people, and let's say it's 6. They are shown like a picture with one line on one side, and then on the other side there are 3 lines of different lengths, and they're asked to say like which line is the same length as the one to this side. I'm describing that very well. And so they'll go through a couple rounds, and they're like, answering it correctly. But like 5 of the people are in on it. And 5 of the people after those first 2 rounds start answering incorrectly on purpose. And the experiment is to show is to test what that 6th person does when in the face of a majority identifying a different reality than their own.
Right. And they expect that person to stand up and flip the table over and say, "You're all insane," and walk out. But they don't.
Because we want to think that we're individuals, and that, we are never subject to social pressures. Or we tend to identify peer pressure as something very overt and deliberate, like, high schoolers drinking beer. Like, I don't know. But that social coercion and pressure is often so much more implicit, and is often so much more environmental and contextual than like an overt action of like, hey, you should do this if you want to be cool. And so,
hey buddy, if you want to be cool, come join this cult.
tell us that this line is this length. And so the
tell us this line.
Right, I don't know. And so I think it was like 80%. This is a study that Steve Hassan talks about, and Steve Hassan is one of the sociologists who's a cult. Is he a sociologist?
No,
he's a cult deprogrammer, which is a controversial term now. He doesn't identify as a deprogrammer, because that was pretty messed up as a process in its own right.
No, they used to like kidnap people back from stuff. No, he was in the Unification Church.
Correct.
In the 70s.
The Moonies.
Yeah. Which I guess we'll get. Is there a Moonies? We'll have to find out. Moonies documentary.
We're going to find out. And Yanya Lalish was part of the Democratic Workers Society.
Right.
And so they each identify these as I was a cult member too. And that's why I'm so invested in trying to figure these things out. So there are all these different reasons that try to make sense of what was going on in this group. Brainwashing and indoctrination and conformity and like downright murder. But what I find really interesting about that, and what I think bears or is worth some discussion, is how we start drawing, speaking of lines, how we start drawing lines between like just basic methods of social formation and something called indoctrination. Because we're all asserting social peer pressure all the time. So Is it about the thing that we are putting pressure on? Is it how we're doing it? Like, so when do methods of social formation become indoctrination? And then also too, like the examples that folks give of people being brainwashed are things like, I'm looking at the quote from A dude from the Christian Research Institute. He was a representative that he was on the. He was interviewed at the end of episode 2. It was a clip from after the suicides, and he's like, once people's lives are conformed to predictable patterns through peer pressure, they dress the same, had the same haircuts. Virtually anything is possible, and it's like, I mean,
have you walked across a college campus before?
Exactly, and exactly, and so like on one hand, like I get it. But yeah, college students do the same thing. Catholic monks do the same thing. And so where we draw that line and why the examples that Steve Hassan gave were like, they made people cut off from family and friends, which I think is a more important one that we could, discuss a bit, but that they made people have check partners and that removed privacy and they changed their names and clothing and diets. And so yes. And
okay, also, if you think about those videos where Doe is going like one by one, he also identifies their individuality. He's like, so and so is sort of the prankster or has so much energy, and this person is always doing this.
Tall Odie is the tall one, and
right? Yeah, and so there's also. We can talk about Star Trek, but like the Borg metaphor gets put forward there, right? But the Borg don't have those same sort of qualities to them, right? Mm-hmm. They don't have the individuality at all, mm-hmm. and so there is on the one hand, yes, a number of practices number of things they do that make them all the same, but then within that, there's also an appreciation, even within them. I mean, Sawyer says at one point, like, I knew that so and so was was going to go ahead of everybody else, and so I was going to get left behind, right? And so it's not all conformity. Mm-hmm. It's not all individuality either. Mm-hmm. But like these are analog knobs that get turned differently in different social arrangements,
right? And we talked last time about the fact that inside of social contexts that are anxious for whatever reason, uncertain, their beginnings in the 70s are a perfect example of this. But like in those times of stress socially, it makes all of the sense that we look for community and a sure thing and someplace to belong, and that is never just an internal process. That quest for belonging or fitting in a community is never just like an introspective process that you are a conversation you're having in your own head. This is also going to affect the way that you dress. It's also going to affect the music you listen to. It's going to affect the shows you watch. And like we are all going to assimilate to some degree. It's just that this group was more insulated. And so where and how we draw those lines when we describe these groups, it is not to say that there was no manipulation. Here's how they really were. That's not what I mean, because I don't feel like it's really any of my business. What I feel like is is like fodder for generative conversation is what we bring to the table when we talk about these groups and what animates our interest in them and why and how and when we feel comfortable identifying ourselves in contradistinction to them as if we are so different and that we could never, and that's not something that's a part of just something called Tuesday.
That's that's kind of the part of the real compelling part of the whole documentary is this constant push and pull between identifying and sort of spurning that the audience is asked to do. Like, do you identify with these family members that are left, these daughters who are left? Do you identify with these people who are looking for something? Do you identify and like, oh, I actually see. And there's this, I think one of the things that the filmmakers, Clay Tweel, the director, producer, does well, I think, is move the audience, or at least attempt to move the audience in between like, oh, like Heaven's Gate, they're just like us, and Heaven's Gate, they're nothing like me. And so that scariness that you talk about, it's like it's sort of constantly moving back and forth in that space.
Well, and in a more general sense, yes, 10,000%. And also too, I mean, like, I think that idea of they're just like me, they're nothing like me. There is something about that I think is at work in the popularity of these documentaries in the first place.
Yes.
I don't know what,
yes.
or, I mean, I haven't I don't know that I can put my finger on why it is that we are trying to answer these questions right now. I mean, I have thoughts, but, and I think it's multi, I think it's multifaceted, but like, when we are looking to groups who seem other in order to make ourselves feel safer, and also like pat ourselves on the back for feeling empathy. It's like we get to do both with these documentaries. We get to feel safe about being so normal in comparison to like people who would wear the same shoes. Oh, I would never. Right. But we also get to be like pretty self-congratulatory about the way that we are able to understand their humanity on a different level than maybe we were before as well.
Yeah. And I think that's actually one of the functions that the Yanya Lelich's and the Steve Hassan's play is like they're as an audience, as a viewer, maybe I'm not the stereotypical viewer of these shows, I don't know, but as a viewer, I also like don't identify.
Everyone else is, but not you.
I'm special.
You are special.
Everyone else, like I'm not identifying with Yanya Lelich. I'm not identifying with Steve Hassan. I think they're a little much. I think they've gone too far.
Sure.
But also, I don't identify with like Sawyer or Frank or anyone else. Like, and I think that that's part of the role of the audience is like you're not gonna like that's the movement is like you're not right and you're not right. I see a little bit in you and a little bit in you, and like you're constantly just trying to like align that. You know, because like the whole point of a documentary about cults, especially a documentary called The Cult of Cults, is that it's already sort of like the difference, the demarcation is sort of like highlighted and done in like a bold, like bright red Sharpie. And so it's a constant kind of then playing with that line and moving back and forth across it as the story goes.
One of the things I think the documentary does really effectively, because I know what you mean, that Lalish and Hassan are a lot. I think all academics are probably a lot. But I thought with every, I was going to say character, which I guess is how Tweel kind of sees them. He talks about the character arcs that he's interested in when making documentaries. But all of the people who were interviewed, I don't know that I related to, I don't know that there was anybody that I was like, that's my person. Like in the way that we...
There's no Carl Lentz here for me.
Yeah.
For those of you who didn't listen to episode 1 or 2.
Thank goodness. There's no Carl Lentz. Well, so, right. There was... and I think that when we watch anything, we kind of map on our own sense of self to the characters that we're seeing on screen and vice versa. And then we, internalize things that we see about them. But in this case, I didn't feel that with anybody, but I also related to everybody, if that makes sense.
Right.
Like
there's a little piece for each little story.
Yeah, because I don't know that I have a lot like in common with Sawyer as a person, but like he's also a dude who lost his friends and misses them terribly. And I get that.
Yeah.
Or like, the daughter of the parents who died, like she understands them. I mean, she gives all of this uh, grace or like leeway to an attempt at finding out like what was animating their choices. And I don't know that I have a similar perspective that she does about a lot of things that she was talking about, but yeah, I can, she lost her parents, and that's hard, and you know what I mean? Like, so I feel like I feel like the documentary did a good job at presenting all of these people being interviewed in really kind of multifaceted ways. What I think is interesting about that, or a little messy and kind of telling, is that the group itself, like Heaven's Gate, while I think Tweel, I mean, he says anyway that he was out to try to complicate our ideas about the group, to try to make us not rush to judgment. But there still is this work done to try to describe the thing that we are looking at through a glass,
Yeah. Everything you just said makes me realize that when you, not that we're keeping a running tally or this is a contest, but like this to me was definitely, of the documentaries we've watched to this point, I think the best made. I think it was, there's a couple production things I'll hit on at some point, but like overall, I think it was one of the most it was the best made documentary. And I think the one that I thought kind of brought the most to the table of all of them. And I think part of that is because of all the stuff you're just saying.
Well, I think what those characterizations do is make us confront and take seriously the things that we were talking about before of like, okay, brainwash, manipulation, social coercion, and here are some home movies where they are really happy and they're doing a talent
singing.
show.
Yes. Oh, it's amazing.
Right? There's a talent show that they have at a Christmas party, 3 months before they die. Or, if we are relating to Sawyer at all in any way, of any kind of piece of him, we have to take seriously the fact that he still believes, and that, he's talking about Doe opening back up the portal or whatever. Yeah. So I think that the question of what we do with their freedom to leave, the lack of, overt coercion, the joy that they express in their home movies and in their exit tapes that they made, the characterizations make us confront that in a way that I don't know that I was, like, I think that's what's effective about it. The other thing that I think is useful to talk about in that vein is the degree to which we love self-editing, except when we don't, because the thing that we point to so often when talking about how weird Heaven's Gate was, and the thing that gets caricatured so much, like we've been talking about, is the shoes, the haircuts, the dress, and it was all in the service of self-editing, and that's something that often, is a social virtue. And in this case, it became a punchline. And so I think that it's also important to look at those elements. You brought up the Borg as an aspirational figure for the group. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I remember the Borg from watching Star Trek.
I'm pitching Star Trek to you because I know how geeked out I get for Star Trek, and so I
have my own personal history with Star Trek.
What's your personal history?
It was on Sunday nights.
Let's take a detour.
It was on Sunday nights. It was the thing we watched after church on Sunday nights as a kid.
After church?
Yeah, in the evenings, because we had evening church.
Yeah.
I worked through all that episode too, but yeah, so but I'm fine with that now.
Sure.
But yeah, it was and I had very I had lots of feelings about Seven of Nine as a teenager, but yeah.
Did you have a favorite character?
On The Next Generation, my favorite character was Q, because he was the best character,
Q was great.
because he just caused complete chaos.
Q is so great. He is an agent of chaos.
And I never knew in an episode that was going to have Q in it. So like, there was a Q episode.
He would just appear.
Yeah, and I was like, oh my god.
And he just like looked like a regular dude, but was all powerful.
Yeah. Looking back, it's like that's some hackneyed plot.
No, it
like
was
device.
brilliant. No, it was brilliant and ahead of its time. Did you? You watched?
I have this standalone episode I've written. What should I do with it? Well, I'll just put Q in it, and now it'll work. Or we'll go to the holodeck, and suddenly it's Sherlock Holmes.
I love the holodeck. It was like getting a period piece, like inside of space. I loved it. I loved every single thing about it.
No, it was a great.
You watched multiple Star Treks though?
I watched a lot of Next Generation, and then because there was a connection to Voyager, that's the one that had 7 of 9 in it, like for a long time. That was I watched that one. Watched a little Deep Space Nine, not as much. Didn't like that one as much.
Yeah.
That one felt like I don't know. That one, it was like Ratchet Star Trek. I don't know.
This is what I think. Okay, so now you've lost me already, and I don't.
You thought that you were going to be, yeah.
Well, no. Here's the thing. This is one of the reasons, I guess, maybe as we again like kind of project our own stuff into these groups that we find interesting. I loved and continue to do so Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Yeah, it's the best one.
I love it so much, and I didn't watch any of the other Star Treks.
None. That's probably a good decision.
None. And there are lots of reasons I love it. I will spare us all that rabbit hole. That could be like a bonus episode. We can do.
We'll do
why Miranda likes
Star Trek: The Next Generation Q episode watch along.
I loved it so much, and my favorite character, not that you asked, is Guinan. Do you remember Guinan?
Yes, Whoopi Goldberg.
Yeah, Whoopi Goldberg with shaved eyebrows was the bartender, and Guinan was like my aspirational figure because Guinan was like wise and super chill and like had insight and also like welcomed you to whatever space you were, like the best bartender, and like also this kind of just insightful BFF plus Zen master. I don't know. Star Trek was one of the approved shows that Heaven's Gate members were able to watch.
For both Heaven's Gate and In My House.
And Doe's favorite character was the Borg, because the Borg, if I don't know, I'm trying to nutshell this for the non-Star Trek Next Generation.
They were a shared consciousness.
They were a shared consciousness, and they were also in the show like very much a villain. And
they had a cube, which I think was like really important because everything else about Star Trek is rounded.
Yeah,
it's a very rounded world. Mm-hmm. And then the Borg was a giant cube.
Yep. Sharp edges. No one had an identity. Everybody was, everyone was the Borg. Like the Borg was one shared consciousness that enacted itself, asserted itself toward all sorts of evil ends. But for Doe, he really dug the Borg because he wanted to talk about the importance of the role that a cog plays in a machine. We want to serve higher causes all the time, and that was what he focused on, was that like we are all part of this class together. We are we have the teachers and we have like our elder members and we learn and whatever, but like they were all part of this mission together. And
which in the show, so much of the conflict points comes between it's always, are the individuals on the Starship Enterprise going to stay together? And so there's this, and I've always rooted for the bad guys, like, and so on
that's why
TV.
you like Q.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so the story is supposed to be about like the kind of individuality of all of the Enterprise, resisting and overcoming the Borg. But there's also this thing of like, but look how hard it is to be all these individuals, right? All these people, like all of those problems stem from being different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the clips that is shown in the documentary of the Borg being the Borg is when they have Data like held captive, and Data is an android whose whole character arc is his attempt to understand and be more human. Like
Right.
that's what we love about Data. And so he has a cat named Spot. And at one episode he tries to have a girlfriend. Oh, one episode I could go on forever.
Doesn't he have like an evil twin at one point?
He does.
Okay.
He also takes comedy lessons from
Yes.
Joe Piscopo.
Yes.
Oh my
Yes,
God.
I remember this one.
That's
you
what
did-
needs,
you did bring-
that's what needs linked in the show notes.
You did bring to mind, just like in my head, the image of when they get Picard and he becomes Borg and he has the thing over his face.
Yeah.
That was just like, that was a moment. That was like the oh shit moment. Like, oh God.
But like Data is not a human, but he's the one explaining to his crew members like the Borg doesn't have individual identities and da da da. But for Doe, that was something highlighting this the group's prioritization of a higher cause. And again, I think that that's something worth paying attention to, because there are lots of contexts in which we think that that's a really great thing. The Olympics are happening right now, and we love having our like individual character stories about this person and that person overcoming whatever in order to get back to the games. But they're still standing on a podium with an anthem playing. They're still there as a conglomerate representing a country. Like we do all sorts of things in that. Like the JFK thing about like asking not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country.
Yeah.
Having like the examples are endless of times that we feel like working for, like being in the service of something bigger than yourself is really wonderful. And so in this case, the fact that it is cast as a kind of villainous thing is really interesting to me.
I mean, it's how we make soldiers.
Yeah.
It's the same. I think every old dumb college football coach that I've ever heard interviewed is coming to mind now about like, we're building this culture and we're all in it together. Like it's the same thing.
I'm sure there are a lot of smart football coaches.
There are. No,
there's
a lot of smart ones.
I don't
too.
know anything about football.
No.
I just feel it incumbent upon me to say that.
I spent like 3 hours the other night playing the new college football video game as if I was a coach. So
that's the next move for your video game character. The anthropologist.
Oh, Michael Altman, the cult founder, becomes. Well, I actually am Mike Altman, offensive coordinator at Duke. So there we go. We're gonna run the triple option. It's gonna be great.
Sure, I'm here for it. Okay, so the Borg is an example of that kind of self-editing that, in this case, seems creepy and weird, but that I think we should be careful when describing too quickly. Another one that then gets a lot of time in the documentary, of course, is sexual chastity, because it wasn't just about being chaste. In this case, it was only a handful of men, but they did this was late into the group, but they went through castration procedures. And so the first, like, Doe is struggling with his own sex drive. This comes out in the documentary at multiple points of like, one of the former members say that, he's trying to make a myth about his body as abhorrent because he doesn't like being gay. There's lots of shame around sex for him. And so the way that plays out then is a total gender neutrality, lots of androgyny, and just trying to like get rid of gender as one of the earthly trappings that confine us instead of liberate us in a more evolved state. But he says at one point, like, hey, everybody, what would you think about this idea? And some of them are like, I don't know. I'll think about that. And then some others were like, yeah, that's the obvious answer.
Yeah. It's a very, this is a part where like Lalish and others sort of like, oh, he was a mastermind controlling all of them, manipulating all of them with these different techniques, really breaks down for me because it feels a lot more like an improv troupe. Like Doe puts this out there and then gets like a yes and from people in the group, and then has to like yes and back. And here
are the things that I think are like, we don't have to get into the nitty gritty. Suffice it to say, there are a few elements about this time in the group and this, you know, this phenomenon in its own right that I think are worth paying attention to. There is, and I think I learned this from the podcast that Glenn Washington did, that like, so Doe presents it as an idea. And then there are like, some of the members are like, yeah, that would be really helpful. And then they kind of bring it to him as, so when can we? Is this what's the vibe? And he says, not yet. I don't know. And then finally someone decides to do it. He allows them to. And when it's Sorority who Sawyer, like talks about as an individual, as like really a go-getter and the kind of like teacher's pet of the group, who's always the most pious and always the most energetic. And so Sorority and Sawyer are both going to get castrated. Sorority goes first. Something goes wrong in the procedure.
Yeah.
And in that moment, when something goes wrong, Doe, and it's the only time that we see Sawyer cry, is talking about this and talking about Doe's response to it, because in that moment, Doe like puts his head in his hands and says, what have I done? I've gone too far.
He tells them to take him to the police. Like it could have all been over right there.
The police. And the members, which again is not to say, is not to speculate about what he meant. Was he using reverse psychology? Like
that's what
Lalish says.
That is what Lalish,
yes.
And that's what they want you to.
That's kind of
to go with.
That's the implicit takeaway.
Is that it was all. There's this thing where, in trying to like uncover the conspiracy, you create this it's almost conspiratorial thinking yourself.
Yeah. Well, because conspiracy is fueled by speculation.
Right.
And in the absence of personal experience or facts, we fill that void with speculation. And that's that, again, quest for meaning making when stuff scares us or doesn't make sense, or that we just are uncomfortable by. Like, so he says, I've gone too far, take me to the police. The people who are there are like 3 of them, say, no, man, we got this. They end up taking Sorority to the hospital.
They call the priest. That was the most interesting.
Can
you imagine
to say, like, do you have any experience with this?
He's like, no.
No, I don't know what you're talking about. So they take him to the hospital, and everything's fine. He stays in the group, and then a handful of other men go through with castration, including Doe.
From a doctor, they find a doctor.
They find a doctor who will do it. But a lot of the men don't.
Yeah.
You know,
most of the men don't.
Right. And so another thing worth paying attention to. So like Doe's response in the first place, I think is one interesting thing. Another thing is, the fact that nobody was forced to do it. So one of the other things that I put in my notes in that section was when Doe fired Dick Jocelyn. Do you remember that part? Dick Jocelyn is the actor who joined at the very beginning. Right. He was in it for a long, long time.
He does a lot of the speaking in those 1976 meetings.
And he's working for Doe at one point. Like, he's one of his helpers. We're not told what that means exactly, but he's like a right-hand man for Doe. And Doe tells him, my vehicle is becoming attracted to your vehicle, and so I don't want you in this space. Right. I think it's better if you aren't working for me in close proximity. And Jocelyn is devastated. And I just, again, I don't want to speculate about anything, but what I think is so, what we are used to hearing, our typical narrative trajectory about cult leaders with sex drives ends in a very different way.
Yes.
Someone's working for them. They are attracted to them. And so they say, let's actually put some distance here because I don't want to overstep.
No one in Heaven's Gate ever was asked to sign an NDA.
Is not what we are right. And so it's just, again, it's just something worth paying attention to.
No, I think I think that there's a, similar to other things we've seen thus far in our journey, there's we're like our own little Starship Enterprise, just flying through the universe of these documentaries. But we've seen people who are unable to deal with their sexual desire. However, and this is maybe an extreme to the other side, but this is a very different response. And I think as we go further, I think it will stand out more and more as in stark contrast. I think you're right.
Yeah. Anyway, so those are the things I pulled out. We look for meaning in weird ways, and we like self-editing until we don't. What did you notice? What are the things you want to talk about?
I mean, I would highlight thinking about the kind of production of the documentary. I think, I don't know. I'd be curious to know what the budget was because they use a lot of licensed music. Mm-hmm. So like, I was finishing up the third episode. Was it the second or third episode? I think it was the third episode where they talk about the Hale Bob. What's been the second one? The Hale Bob comet comes through and it goes to the credits, and it's the Ace of Base song. I Saw the Sign, and right. my one of my kids, my teenage kids, walks through and he's just like, he's like, what are you watching? I was like, this thing about this cult that follows the comet, and he plays like, wow, a good song. Like he got the joke, but like,
it's a good song.
I think. There's that. There was an Amy Mann song at the very end. That's really interesting.
Speaking of 90s.
So there's a lot of like the licensed music throughout, I think, is really, really interesting. And then the other piece of that, and this was something that comes up in that interview, and it's a YouTube like half-hour interview with the director. We'll post it in the show notes. But he talked about the composer who did the score said that he wasn't going to use any percussion in the score because percussion grounds you.
So interesting.
And so the whole point of the music that's sort of scoring all of this is to give it this kind of surreal, ethereal, dreamlike feel. And then you couple that with, there was a Radiohead song at one point, but you couple that with like the animations that they'd use. And I think it was an interesting choice because the way I read it, if I put my amateur film analysis hat on, is that there's this challenge with Heaven's Gate in that they have this sort of alternate reality or the sort of alternate narrative story, we might call it a myth, about, the next level and the older members and where they're going, and like, that there's this thing out there that no one can see. And the animations, at first I thought they were weird and kind of othering, but I realized that like as the documentary progresses, they're working to give you a sense of actually the reality of that world. And I thought what was most interesting in the way that it kind of comes full circle is there's you have all these animations mostly about like people leaving and like the claims people have and the stories they tell about what's out there in the space or the spaceship or the next level. But then at the very, very end of the last episode, Frank tells what I thought was the most interesting story that he of his whole interviews, where he talks about having, as this after the suicides, he has one last dream of Erica. And I think in a brilliant move by the director or whoever came up with this idea, they do an animation of this dream of Erica coming back to him and then Erica like walking out into the ocean. And it's this moment where Frank's dream is part of that same mythical world that all of this is happening in.
Yeah.
And it's sort of this fascinating kind of full circle moment. And I just like, that was one of those moments that was just like, when I say like this, I think this is the most well-made one we've seen. It's like, that was it. Like, we have Frank who goes from leaving Erica there to Erica actually leaving him in the dream right after she's died. And so I thought that was just such an elegant way to tell the stories that animate all of the actions that we can see without making them look like weirdos, right? Like they can, and the way that they did the animations, the way they did, like they use actual like little gray men for it, which is what they were using in the, you know, in the group. But it I don't know. I thought that worked really, really well.
I agree with you. I thought that moment was really intense. That story where he's talking about her as the love of his life, and I think that reading is really compelling. I think that's I think you're on to something. I think that's a really the juxtaposition of that level of care and nuance with the subtitle Cult of Cults.
Yes.
is a good nutshell of what I find so interesting and also unsettling and compelling in equal measure about this. And again, like it was Doe that said we're the cult of cults. Like it was his words, but the thing that you pull out to make your title, it just
because I don't actually think we're early in this project, and so it's hard. We don't have a lot to compare it to, but I feel like this is actually not the Cult of Cults. Like this is actually.
We won't try to identify it, everyone. It's okay.
No, we'll have a
we'll rank our
rank
top
our
100
cults at some point. Yeah, like which is the cultiest of all the cults?
That would undercut our basic point, Michael.
It would give the audience a chance to think about what we have at stake in this conversation. But
right in.
But I don't think it's actually the cultiest cult, because it's actually, I think, stands out as like, because there's a lot of context about in episode 3 about Waco and the Branch Davidians, which we'll get to, Jonestown, which we'll get to next, and sort of the swirl of 90s cultness that's happening. And I think that's where you see, I think, the way that they're very different, even though they had some of the same fears. Like they had the same story, but they almost like this is a question I keep having, is like, how many cult leaders are aware of other cult leaders? And so that Doe was like, no, they could come for us too when they watched, you know. And it's funny because we talked about early on, the very beginning of the last episode, about, you know, associating this with Waco and like Oklahoma City bombing and that period, that era, and they were doing the same thing in the moment. And I think
for sure, and it's also at a time when people are. It is not unusual for folks to be afraid of the government, especially for groups kind of living on the outskirts of mainstream society. And it's also when like conspiracy theory radio is doing a thing, like Art Bell, this host of an AM radio show.
Did you ever listen to Art Bell?
No, I didn't know who that was. You knew who that was?
I would lay in bed with my little clock radio and like scan AM stations for like baseball games or whatever.
This is after you finished Star Trek on a Sunday?
Yes, I would lay there on a Sunday night thinking of 7 of 9, scanning the AM stations, and I'd come across it like every once in a while. Wasn't like an avid listener, didn't know enough of like how to find it every time, but it was definitely a thing. Like I didn't know it was Art Bell at the time. I just knew it was like that guy on the radio with the weird stories. But like, looking back, I'm like, that was
radio show trafficking and conspiracy theories that had a few people on talking about. I saw a ship behind the comet, which is what got the group.
He was Joe Rogan before there was Joe Rogan.
I mean, I just
And
feel
actually,
like
Joe Rogan was on his show for a long time.
Oh, no kidding?
That's how Joe Rogan got his. You could read Joe Rogan as a spinoff of Art Bell.
That's an interesting subplot
And
to this
and
whole
I
thing.
I got very into Art Bell for a minute this week as I was thinking about this. So I'm glad you brought it. Like, there's not a good. I don't know of a good biography of Art Bell. So
Yet.
Well, yeah, let me add it to the long list of things that I won't be writing ever. But if you're out there, I know that there's at least 2 graduate students listening to this podcast. Free dissertation ideas. Art Bell and the Metaphysics of American Religion writes itself.
But like lots of people were afraid of the government at this point, for sure.
No, I mean, I think
like looking into space and seeing, you know, but also like being super conspiratorial about what the government was up to.
Yeah, I mean, before 9/11, the FBI's most of its resources going into paying attention to fringe radical domestic groups engaged in, you know, usually coming from the far right with apocalyptic millennial, you know, Christian identity, Branch Davidian types. So yeah. The other thing about the documentary that was helpful from that interview with Tweel, the filmmaker, was he talked about trying to put everything into kind of a hero's journey, and that made Sawyer's story and Frank's story kind of it made it all make sense. And there's a really, in some ways, I think it made me realize how tragic Sawyer's story is.
Yes.
Because the failure of the castration, his failure to go through with the castration, that's what he calls it.
Yep.
It prefigures. I have an English degree. Prefigures the failure to graduate. And so, like, Sawyer's the Charlie Brown of Heaven's Gate. That like football keeps getting moved every time.
Sawyer leaves because he starts like being unable to control his masturbation. And he talks about like how when anyone would have like a wet dream, like a nocturnal emission, they would have to write it in a log. And that's some, you know, like, speaking of social shaming, like that's not a great look. And so people are wanting to try to keep that to themselves in some cases. And Sawyer was really feeling the cognitive and you know, like emotional dissonance of being one of the primary members of the group, being at the front of a lot of the meetings that they had when they took things on the road, and also struggling with his own sex drive that he didn't feel like he could control. And so again, though, like, you expect that story to end one way.
Right.
But the way that it goes is Doe says to Sawyer, "You've been a little distant." And then Sawyer tells him what's up. And then Doe is like, "Well, that's tough, buddy, but you're not hurting anybody. And I understand that you want to like stay with us and that this is important to you. So we can work with this. It's going to be okay." And Sawyer keeps trying and it just doesn't take.
Yeah.
And so he feels like if he's being really honest with his own sense of dogma and piety and commitment to his ideals, that he can't in good conscience stay in the group and be struggling with his sex drive. And so Doe says, okay, here's $600 and a plane ticket.
And I think that those two stories, that story about Sawyer, and then we've already talked about with Doe and Dick Jocelyn, I think they make the third plot point that jumped out, or plot device that jumped out at me even starker, which is what I wrote down: Chekhov's tease letters. So, you know, Chekhov's line about if there's a shotgun in Act 1, it should go off by Act 3.
Right.
Well, we know in early in the episode, the first episode probably, I think it is, that T has been writing letters to her daughter. She has them this whole time. And then it's left. And they don't talk about it again until the fourth episode.
Yeah.
And it comes up when they have a Heaven's Gate reunion. This is after the suicides with former members and former members' families. And she shows up there, which, that they invited her.
Yes.
right? An outsider who it's like
Yes.
it was sort of everyone who's been affected by this, which is its own community building moment that I
Which
find
involved what's his name? What's the guy who went undercover?
yeah, the sociologist. Yes.
Blosh?
Bloch.
I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Yeah.
He was there too. Like he had been writing essays, like he had been writing news articles about this group, and he gets to come.
Robert Balch.
Former members who feel like they've been brainwashed are there. Dick Jocelyn, for example. But then there's I don't remember her name either. The little old lady that like still was a hardcore believer, and that she and Dick Jocelyn were hanging out and being buds. And so I think that reunion in its own right is a really good reflection of just how, but I don't even know what the adjective is, like how
these were people who were all very open to relationship and connection, as much as they were disconnecting from their families, and as much as that is not to, I do not question how much pain,
right,
T's daughter went through, and the people who lost people, and at all, don't know what that feels like. But at the same time, everyone involved was drawn into this thing because of a desire for some sort of relationship and community,
right,
and that there would be that after a group suicide, that the people affected would have a group reunion. Says something about the real sort of thirst for, and like community doesn't even seem like the right word, because we throw that around like, I'm so thankful for my community.
Right.
And it's like, what do we really mean by that? It really starts to ask questions about like what we actually mean about that, especially in like 2024.
Sure.
But the letters, I think were just a very remarkable, like, because T is supposed to be, she was the, they say early on that she was the real power behind all of it, and how much it affects everything when she dies. But then these letters and how there's a variety of reactions to it. I just thought it was such a remarkable, it was a very well, I didn't see it coming. I didn't expect it. They had planted the seed, and it was one of those moments of like, oh wow, that was very, yes. Like, oh wow. Like, it was like this is my one, I'm using my one card here. It was like, it's like a very good finish to a pro wrestling match. You don't see it coming, but then it makes perfect sense. And it's that sort of surprise, like, oh wow. Oh wow. Okay. Anyways, what's your big takeaway? What do we
Well, I mean,
what are we taking with us on down the road?
I'm sitting here
if
kind
this was
of
Jerry
mulling
Springer, what's your
say,
final thought?
Right.
Be kind to one another.
Where you say like, and what even is a cult? And it kind of just made me like, I'm taking like I don't know, I'm sighing.
I think what is a cult might not be the best question.
Well, I guess maybe that's my takeaway, is that I feel like, not unlike our search to make and manufacture meaning in the face of confusion and disorientation, I think that there is a lot embedded in the attempt to distinguish religion and cults in the first place, and that we should think about what we're actually trying to answer for ourselves, because I don't know that when we try to distinguish religion from cult, we are doing so out of some unalloyed interest in religion.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the Tweel interview, he distinguishes between he kind of lands on like, it's just an unanswerable question. I don't know that I find that super satisfying, but I appreciated the fact that he distinguished between sociologists who really have a list. Like, here are the demarcating features that characterize cults, and they do this and they do this. And then on the other hand, religious studies scholars that he spoke to were like, I mean, a lot of religions are cults. If you want to, like, the religion or cults plus time equals religion.
Yeah.
That
It's
that
all very,
idea.
very Big Lebowski. That's just your opinion, man.
That's just your opinion, man. And so I think that's a useful distinction, but I don't think that the like those two approaches, but I don't think then that the conclusion is it's just unanswerable. I don't know. I think maybe my conclusion or my takeaway is that each person, even asking the question or interested in the group, in any group that they want to identify in this way or that way or something else entirely, is bringing a lot to the table from jump, just in asking in the first place. And I guess that's my takeaway. It was I like this documentary because I think that it at least asked for. I don't think it did it perfectly, but I think it asked for some self-reflection.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that, and I think kind of another way into that for me is the kind of question about like the self-editing and all of the practices that were make it a cult, but we could easily associate with like Christian monasticism or even Buddhist monasticism or a variety of other things.
And that sometimes self-editing can hurt people.
Right. Oh no, for sure. But that these that one of the ways that things end up becoming categorized or understood as cults, or that calling something a cult is another way to talk about it as kind of religion out of place. So when I planted my garden this year, I used a bunch of compost from my compost bin, and apparently there was a lot of squash seeds in the compost. And so I had around my cucumbers a crap ton of squash volunteers that began to choke out the cucumbers. And most of the time, I don't think of squash as a weed. But in that moment, that squash was a weed, right? And so in some ways, I think we have these rules. And this is why stuff that was in the past was not a cult, if it happened now, would definitely be a cult. Because we have these rules, the sort of rules of secular modernism or modernity, to use a kind of fancy language for it, of like religion is this thing that's supposed to be personal and it can ask this much of you, but not more than that. And it should happen in these places, but not these other places. And this was sort of the question in the Hillsong documentary, like, what is the church supposed to do with all of its money? And so anytime something, a group, a community, an institution, an individual is doing something that they are calling religion, or we want to call religion, and it sort of overwhelms those boundaries in some way. It's religion in the wrong place or time. It's religion, and some of those things are very harmful. Like it's religion that's causing great harm. It's religion that's causing that is too all-encompassing. It's not staying in its space as a kind of personalized, private thing you do in your home or in these specific institutions and these specific times in these specific ways. That's when it becomes a cult, right?
Sunday evenings right before Star Trek is when it's supposed to happen.
Yes, that's exactly. That's exactly.
No, that makes loads of sense. That's a really, really good point.
What's your cult favorite?
Well, speaking of gardens, I experimented thanks to a friend who came over and helped me build some garden boxes. I've been experimenting with like growing things this summer to eat. And I haven't been very good at pruning. I've just been like letting everything go nuts. So it's really a labyrinth now, but there's
no secularism in your garden.
No, and there's also though I had volunteer cantaloupes from my compost, but my cult favorite is it's we're at the end of the summer, we're about to go back to school, we're not able to hang at home in the same way, and so I want to like send some love to cilantro stems. Those are my cult favorite because I was growing cilantro and they grow really fast. And so I had a ton of cilantro. And I also came into possession of Yadam Ottolenghi's Simple Cookbook. Do you know who that is? He's a celebrity chef but like a fancy celebrity chef.
But
you know,
a simple and fancy.
Well, yeah. So simple is great because, well, it's whatever. Go look up simple, everybody. I highly recommend. But that's not my cult favorite. It's specifically cilantro stems because this dude uses like a half cup of cilantro stems for so many things. I will never compost a cilantro stem ever again. I'm going to put them in everything that I make.
What do you do with the leaves?
Well, you use those too for
Okay.
like other things, like in the stuff that you would
Just see piles and piles of cilantro leaves that you don't know what to do with
You
because
feed
all
those
the
to the
recipes
rabbit. I
are
don't
just
know.
the stems.
like no, you
You have
no,
a rabbit?
No, I don't have
Oh.
a rabbit. I have a leopard gecko, a regal beast. But you know, you use that like cilantro. You use cilantro, dude. But like the stems, Mike, the stems are a much overlooked and very underrated part of cilantro. And that is my cult favorite this week.
That is excellent.
It is excellent. It's delicious and nutritious. What is your cult favorite?
My cult favorite is not nearly as practical.
Not so green.
It's green. It's pretty green, but it's not nearly as practical. And it is a gift that I was given for my birthday this summer. It's called the Author Clock. So podcasting is a visual medium, so I can't really show you, but
you could do it on a TikTok video.
I should.
Now that we have TikTok.
Well, maybe I'll get sponsored and start getting free ones. But the Author Clock is, imagine a small, like, bedside clock, and the screen, instead of being a clock, is like a Kindle, like a Kindle Paperwhite, like that e-ink screen, right? And on it, instead of displaying just the time like a normal clock, it displays a passage, a sentence or two, maybe a small paragraph from some book somewhere, some usually fiction somewhere, with the time in it. So it'll be like, it was 9:15 when I took the trash outside, and at 9:15, and it'll say like, for every minute of the day, it has a different passage that it pulls from a library of quotes from a variety of books.
That sounds
and
amazing.
It always gives you the title and then the author in the corner.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first is, do they distinguish between AM and PM? Like,
yes,
is there a book that actually like invokes 3:16 AM? You know what I mean?
Yes. I saw there was one from Ulysses not too long ago when I was looking at it. There are a variety of books that use AM and PM in there.
Well, no, I know, but like, if you can't find, I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't always,
Mm-hmm.
but it does accurately often, and you can have it. There's a setting where you can say you want like near time, and so it'll be like, it was almost a quarter to, and it'll use that. Or if there's like a reference,
like approximate.
Yeah, if there's an approximate time, that's the word, approximate time. If there's a quote that is an approximate time, it will flash that up.
My second question is whether you actually see the time, though. Like,
it's bolded.
In the corner. Okay.
It's bolded. You can turn it on to have the time at the top, like a normal clock, like a digital clock.
Okay.
But I have that turned off because I want to read. I want to look at it and read through it. But it bolds the printed time.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's in Word. Sometimes it's whatever it is in the. But it's a a wild little device.
That's
Again,
cool.
it's utter uselessness. It's not a good clock. It's not helpful. It's in the same room as it's in my kitchen. So it's like I have a stove clock and a microwave clock. And this thing.
Can you use it? Like, can you set timers and things on
No,
it?
it's no. You can do nothing but be fed random pieces. And like, there's no link. You can't like hit a button and go buy the book or go read the book. You can't.
That would be smart, though.
That's
the second version of it.
No. It is beautiful because of its impracticality. Because of it is because what you have is you have a moment with that passage. And that's all you get.
A moment of time, you might say.
A moment of time, a pause. And what'll happen is like my kids will walk by and they'll just walk up to it and read it to themselves, like randomly.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, it's incredibly
fun for the whole family.
I love it for its beautiful impracticality, which will be the name of my autobiography.
Yeah. Well, I'll lend you some cilantro stems and you can use those in your kitchen while you look at the time. And then you can feel like you have a balance of practical and impractical.
That's right. That's all. Yes, I need more balance. So,
here for you.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to Cult Favorite. You should join us by subscribing to the podcast on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And when you subscribe, be sure to leave us a rating and a review. You can also follow us on X or Instagram or TikTok at @CultFavoritePod. We would love to hear your feedback. Also, you can DM us or leave a comment on this episode in Spotify. Also, special thanks to the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama for production assistance. We will be back next week with, are we doing Jim Jones?
Yeah, we are. Yeah.
So if you want to do the homework, your homework is to watch Cult Massacre, One Night in Jonestown. It's on Hulu. It's a National Geographic. And that's where we're headed next week.
Yay.
We'll see you all then.